The French Revolution is often viewed through the lens of ideology, but the period between 1789 and 1799 serves as a precise record of how complex states mathematically fail. To understand why an absolute monarchy detonates, we have to examine the 5 specific vectors that compromise the old regime: social stratification, sovereign insolvency, subsistence failure, intellectual frameworks, and external precedents. By 1789, the French state was no longer navigating standard political friction. The monarchy was confronting a physical impossibility regarding its own survival. This chart plots the demographic pressure building inside the country. Over the 18th century, the French population swelled from 23 million to 28 million people. Simultaneously, domestic grain yields stagnated. Demand outpaced supply. The price of a basic loaf of bread skyrocketed, and wages remained flat. The old regime entered a severe subsistence crisis, threatening the basic livelihood of millions. At the exact moment the state needed resources to manage this hunger, the Bourbon dynasty was entirely insolvent. Decades of military conflicts, including heavily financing the American Revolution, had pushed the national debt past 2 billion livres. Lenders demanded a 10% interest rate, meaning the massive bulk of the royal budget was consumed solely by servicing debt. Decades of royal extravagance and foreign wars had bankrupted the treasury at the precise historical moment the starving population reached critical mass. To service that debt, the state relied on a rigid, birth-based hierarchy known as the 3 estates, which dictated exactly who paid taxes and who did not. This diagram visualizes the demographic asymmetry of that system. The first estate of the clergy and the second estate of the nobility accounted for roughly 2% of the population. The remaining 98%, everyone from wealthy merchants to impoverished peasants, made up the third estate. The top 2% controlled 60% of the land and enjoyed sweeping aristocratic privileges, including total exemption from state taxes. The entire financial burden of the French Empire, the direct state tithe, and the church tithe was extracted exclusively from the 98% holding the least amount of wealth. Under normal historical conditions, an impoverished underclass might riot and eventually be suppressed. But Enlightenment philosophers provided this specific underclass with a new intellectual framework. Thinkers argued that human rights are derived from nature and existence, not mandated by divine will or aristocratic birth. The recent success of the American Revolution in 1776 transitioned these ideas from theory to reality. It provided the French populace with empirical proof that overthrowing a monarchy to build a functioning republic was physically possible. A population explosion colliding with an empty grain supply and an empty treasury created a hungry demographic. The intellectual frameworks of the Enlightenment forged them into a revolutionary one. The immediate rupture began in May 1789. Desperate to pass new taxes to avoid default, King Louis XVI convened the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. Voting was conducted by estate, meaning the first and second estates could always outvote the massive third estate, 2-1. The representatives of the third estate refused to participate under these archaic rules. They demanded a system of one member, one vote, a sudden operational pivot from feudal obedience directly toward popular sovereignty. When the king rejected the demand, the third estate walked out, assembled on an indoor tennis court at Versailles, and declared themselves the National Assembly, swearing to draft a constitution that would permanently limit the king's power. As the king mobilized troops around Paris, political tensions snapped into physical violence. On July 14th, a citizen militia stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that stood as the symbol of royal despotism. They killed the commander, dismantled the structure, and claimed the city. Peasant uprisings cascaded across the countryside throughout the summer, attacking chateaus and burning records of manorial dues. To halt the violence, the National Assembly passed the August 4th decree, legally abolishing the feudal system of obligations, confiscating church lands, and stripping the clergy and nobility of their privileges. In a matter of weeks, a rigid, centuries-old absolute monarchy had its authority dismantled in the streets and legally erased in the assembly. By 1791, the National Assembly completed its primary objective, drafting a new constitution that legally transformed France into a constitutional monarchy. They dismantled absolute rule by implementing a separation of powers. Governance was divided between an independent judiciary, a 745-member legislature, and an executive branch where the king retained veto power over laws. The ideological cornerstone of this new government was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a document establishing that liberty, property, and security were natural, inalienable human rights. This diagram maps the total French population of 28 million people through the new legal classifications of enfranchisement. The universal promises of the revolution immediately clashed with the reality of who was allowed to participate in the new state. Voting rights were strictly limited to a category called active citizens. To qualify, you had to be a man over the age of 25 who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage. Out of 28 million people, only about 4 million met this threshold. The remaining 24 million people, including all women, the peasantry, and the urban poor, were legally classified as passive citizens. They possessed basic civil rights, but were entirely denied the right to vote or hold political office. The revolution replaced an aristocracy of birth with an oligarchy of wealth, legally subjugating the vast majority of the population under a constitution that claimed to guarantee universal freedom. The constitutional monarchy failed to resolve the core issues of inflation and food shortages. This economic failure shifted power toward radical factions, like the Jacobin Club, who drew their support from the sans-culottes, the working-class shopkeepers and artisans suffering the most from the soaring prices. By the summer of 1792, facing foreign invasion and domestic starvation, Jacobin-led militias stormed the Palace of Tuileries and imprisoned the royal family. In September, a newly elected convention officially abolished the monarchy entirely, declaring France a republic. The republic severed all ties to its past. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was convicted of treason and publicly beheaded by guillotine in the center of Paris. Under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre, the Jacobins initiated the Reign of Terror. From 1793 to 1794, revolutionary tribunals arrested and executed tens of thousands of people. The targets were not limited to ex-nobles. The guillotine claimed rival politicians, ordinary citizens, and dissenting members of the Jacobin Party itself. Journalists like Camille Desmoulins argued that true liberty required justice and reason, warning that the mass executions were multiplying the Republic's enemies. Robespierre countered that swift, severe terror was synonymous with justice, arguing it was the only mechanism capable of protecting the Republic. Robespierre had Desmoulins executed. Unchecked ideological purity eventually cannibalized its own architects. By July 1794, terrified of their own leader, the convention turned on Robespierre, sending him to the guillotine and proving that the pursuit of total liberty can easily devolve into state-sponsored tyranny. The execution of Robespierre left a power vacuum, which wealthier middle-class factions quickly filled, seizing control of the state apparatus and denying voting rights to the non-propertied classes once again. They drafted a new constitution establishing the Directory, an executive council of 5 members designed explicitly to prevent the rise of another one-man dictatorship. Instead, the directors constantly clashed with the legislative councils, resulting in political gridlock. 10 years of perpetual revolution, mass executions, and economic chaos exhausted the French public. They craved stability over ideology, creating an open lane for a military general named Napoleon Bonaparte to seize power in a coup. While Napoleon ultimately crowned himself emperor, ending the Democratic Republic, he did not erase the revolution. He codified its core legal principles, equality before the law and the protection of private property, into the Civil Code of 1804, building an efficient legal system that spread across Europe. The decade-long search for democratic stability concluded with a military dictatorship, one that permanently cemented the legal framework the revolution had fought to create. The old regime never returned. The French Revolution permanently destroyed the feudal system, replacing subjects of a crown with citizens of a nation. It introduced secular governance, constitutional law, and the concept of natural human rights to the global political sphere. These concepts, liberty, equality, and fraternity, migrated far beyond the borders of Europe. In India, leaders like Tipu Sultan and Raja Ram Mohan Roy engaged with these ideas to challenge colonial authority and advocate for political reform. This continuity of thought eventually reached the mid-20th century, when the Indian Constitution formally adopted these three terms as its guiding democratic principles. Yet, the legacy of the revolution is defined by the severe contradiction between its radical theory and its deeply selective practice. Women were active participants from the very first day, marching on Versailles and founding political clubs. In 1791, Olympe de Gouges published the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, demanding full political equality. For criticizing the revolutionary government's exclusion of women, she was charged with treason and executed. The republic that claimed to liberate humanity forcibly closed women's clubs and banned their political activity. French women would not secure the right to vote until 1946, over a century and a half after the fall of the Bastille. In the Caribbean colonies, wealthy plantation owners interpreted liberty strictly as their individual right to profit from the transatlantic slave trade. The universal rights of man were deliberately suspended overseas, delaying the final abolition of French colonial slavery until 1848. The collapse of the old regime demonstrates the sheer force required to dismantle an entrenched hierarchy. But it also proves that while declaring universal human rights takes only a moment, executing them across an entire population is a struggle that takes generations.